This week we're talking about the colonial economy, and I'm using as an example Nigeria, southeastern Nigeria, and specifically the developments that occurred there in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. And for this discussion, we are going to have a visitor, Professor Carolyn Brown, who's a professor at Rutgers University and who's an expert on southeastern Nigeria. We're reading an article by her this week that will give you some dimensions of the incident that is the focus point, which is a strike at a coal mine in eastern Nigeria. And Professor Brown will explain the context and the significance of this incident. But let me first give you a little bit of background in terms of the region. This is a region that ethnically is very heavily, indeed entirely, Igbo, and it's an area of Nigeria that's been very much involved, or was very much involved, in the nationalist movement that led to the independence of Nigeria, and was very heavily involved in the post-independence crisis that led to the civil war in Nigeria that's known as the Biafra War. But we're going to be looking now at the colonial period. And this part of Nigeria is interesting because it was an area in which there was no political state in the pre-colonial period. The region was really governed by village-level democratic government. Villages were organized into a series of villages, often 4 villages. And they had their own mechanism for government, for holding markets, for settling disputes, and so on. The region as a whole of southeastern Nigeria was very densely populated. It's in the forest, and in this part of the forest there's a very heavy concentration of palm oil trees. And the palm trees produce an oil that's used in cooking, that's used in a variety of industrial purposes, and therefore it was a cash crop that was resulted in the export of palm oil and palm kernels to Britain for use in making soap and for many other purposes. So that the economy was based on agriculture until the colonial period. Once the British conquered Nigeria, they imposed a system of government on top of the existing democratic system, which they called warrant chiefs. They appointed chiefs who were given warrants, that is, pieces of paper that gave them authority, and they governed over much bigger areas. The people didn't like the system. They also didn't like the idea that the British insisted that people pay taxation to the colonial state, and hence there was a lot of resistance to the British in this area. With the construction of a railroad through this region, and also from Lagos north to the northern part of the country, there was a need for fuel to run the railroad, and it happened in the Igbo area. There was coal. Coal was discovered, and hence coal mines were opened up. And so the incident we're going to look at is actually how the workers in the coal mines and their political action, their economic action during that colonial period. Professor Brown did a lot of research on this topic, which she will explain in what follows. First, let me tell you, Professor Brown is is a colleague that I've known for many, many years. She and I have actually published an edited book together, and we have been very good friends for many, many years. And I have done research in the area that she works in southeastern Nigeria, through the assistance that she provided me in terms of what I should do in the archives, where I should look, and what I should see in the work that I was doing. But so there's the brief introduction. I will be interviewing Professor Brown, so you'll be hearing my voice perhaps sometimes, but you will be seeing her.
All right.
Yep.
Okay. My name is Professor Carolyn Brown. I teach African history at Rutgers University in New Jersey, New Brunswick, New Jersey. My area of specialization is labor history and also urban social history. And I am working also on, my work also is on gender, and I work on masculinity, nationalism, and worker consciousness. One of the other things that I do, which is really fascinating, is that I'm also working on a project about an ex-slave community in South New Jersey, which is called Timbuktu. And it was set up in the 1820s, and it had people who were freed from slavery, but it was also on the Underground Railroad route, which is the route of escaping slaves. And we also, what we have recently done with Paul Lovejoy and a number of other people, is we brought some people from Mali who are from Timbuktu, brought them to New Jersey so they could meet the people who live in that community. And we set up a system where students in New Jersey are able to talk to students in Mali about Timbuktu, and we've translated some of the materials about our Timbuktu here into French for students in Bamako. So that's kind of an exciting project that gives us an opportunity to bring Africa and African American history together. So, but that's not what I'm supposed to talk about today. I'm going to talk about this project that was my PhD dissertation and my first book. And it was a project that looks at the history of a coal mine, a series of coal mines actually, that were in southeastern Nigeria, that were opened up during World War I and stayed open until about 1950 or so. It's a coal mine that has a very important role in the history of nationalism in Nigeria, because in 1949, 22 of the coal miners were massacred by the colonial government in the midst of a strike to get higher wages. And it occurred at a time in which all the colonial officials were very nervous about independence movements. They were nervous about communism because this is the Cold War. And they, partly because of misunderstandings, they ended up, the police chief ended up telling his troops to shoot at these unarmed unarmed workers. So this is now, in all the history books about Nigeria, it's referred to as the beginning of the independence movement. And it really did galvanize that movement. It brought people closer together. There were a couple of riots in some of the cities, etc. But my interest in it was more from the standpoint of a labor historian. And so what I looked at was just to document the history of work, the history of these people who became laborers and who worked in the coal mines. First, I should say a little bit about why the coal mines were important. This is like the early 1900s, when most of the major energy source was steam, and the steam was fueled by coal. And so both the railroads and most of the ships were fueled by coal. Some of the coal, in the case of West Africa, it was coal that was coming from England, especially from Wales. And then when they discovered this coal mine in Nigeria, this was a great discovery because it meant that they could actually not rely on the coal from England and rely much more on coal that's available in eastern Nigeria. Yeah, one of the reasons that was key is because coal miners in England were some of the most militant, unpredictable workers, and a lot of the time they would strike. And so the assumption was that these workers in Nigeria wouldn't be the same. That was not accurate because they acted exactly like coal miners do everywhere else, which is they're very, very militant. You've just read an article that I wrote about the shooting. And that article is it okay? It's all right?
Yeah.
Okay. The article is about the shooting incident. And Dr. Lovejoy wants me to give you a sense of the context of this kind of case study. This area, southeastern Nigeria, is a place that was very engaged in the slave trade. We know that just about 1 million people came from out of this area during the period from the late 18th century until the mid 19th century. One of the effects that this slave trade had was that it actually encouraged the development of internal slavery. And so when these coal mines opened, one of the groups that gets pushed into the into the labor force is actually a group of people who were locally known as slaves. And the word for slave was ohu, O-H-U. So what my study looked at was just how difficult it was for a colonial government to generate a labor force in an area in which people are pretty much self-sufficient in terms of their basic needs. And they really don't need to be working for wages because they are producing on their own land. The problem that confronted the British was, how do you make Africans, come and work in your industries? And so the first group of people who came into the workforce were actually the product of the conquest of the area. And that is when the British armies, the colonial armies, which were made up of other colonial people, actually, they came into eastern Nigeria. It was not until about 1902, so it was quite late. And at the time when the coal mines opened in 1914, they were still pacifying the area. And so what they did is that as they defeated people, these different groups, villages, they required that they supply a certain amount of labor. So that's how they got the first group of workers. It was one thing to get the group of workers. It was another thing to make them work. And so what happened very often was people deserted, or they just slowed down the work process so they didn't have to really exert themselves. So those forms of resistance were actually what we called hidden forms of resistance. Desertion, though, is not hidden, but it was very hard for them to keep people on the mines because the work there was very, very rough. The people that were in the labor force came from villages around the perimeter of Enugu, which was the city where the mines were located. That area was an area that had two major regions. On the west side, there was a mountain range, not a very high one, but one, it was called an escarpment. And this is where a number of villages, very, very large villages, were perched in this area. Historians believe that these people came into this area because they were fleeing slave traders, because of the wars and the kidnapping that was involved in getting slaves. But to the east and the valley of this region, there were people who actually were involved in the slave trade, and they had incorporated slaves in their own communities as workers and as really as subordinates. And so it wasn't really, it's not a place where you'd see the two groups being equal. There was this whole assumption that the people who were living on the ridge were really slave-like. And so there was a discrimination against them. And then there was also in the other community, in the villages in the valley, you had a number of people who were being treated as slaves, even though slavery was supposed to be illegal by the 20th century. You had communities that had people in them who were being treated as slaves by others who were the freeborn communities. This kind of slavery was one of the sort of controversial themes that we have in African history. There's always a controversy about slavery in Africa, whether it was the same as slavery in the New World or whether it was really different. It depended on how slaves were used. That means, by that I mean, plantation slavery is not it's not nice. Let's say it's always very brutal. And we did have plantations that were run by Africans in the Calabar region, which is right on the coast. But in most of the areas in eastern Nigeria where you had slaves, they were people only working a certain number of days in a week. They worked on land that was owned by the freeborn community or their masters. And the rest of the time they could work on land that they were allowed to grow their own crops on. So it was a kind of, the British were very confused about exactly what it was. Sometimes they called them serfs, but people were really treated as slaves. They were bought and sold. And so it was there, and there was a lot of discrimination against them in terms of what they weren't allowed to do. They weren't allowed to do anything that was any kind of rituals or anything that were performed by people who were freeborn and that signified their position of being distinguished or the upper levels of the society. So when you look at it very closely, it's not exactly like the kind of slavery we have, but in a funny way, it's the fact that people still are discriminated against who are former slaves. That is very much like what we have in our country, where where people who are descendants of slaves are treated in a discriminatory way. So let's see. I think that for your purposes, it may be helpful if I said a little bit about what these communities are like, besides the fact that you have slaves in one community and people who tend to get in, who have a history of being enslaved in the other. These are communities that are largely agricultural. People live in villages with people who they think they're related to. And there's usually a myth of a common ancestor, and that in a way serves as a way of holding people together. It's almost like having a constitution that there's certain things you don't do to people who are your relatives. So even if they're not real relatives, ideologically they're considered to be relatives. In those communities, there were very few chiefs in this region. You had no kings. And decisions were made by councils of senior men. And those councils would be representing various kinship groups, various lineages, rather. And lineage being, people who are related by blood to each other. So these councils then made decisions about a number of things. One of the most important is the decision about allocating land, the use of land, not actually the land itself, because you couldn't alienate land in this area until, deep into the 20th century. So what happened is that these councils would make a decision that could affect your whole family. If they gave you land that was so far away you could not get there, in one day, or that you have to stay overnight there, that affected the ability of your family to grow enough crops, especially to try to sell crops to the city, which is the coal mines, once the coal mines are set up. Secondly, people could well, a number of people were trading food as well, and so if you produce a surplus, you could do that, and so many of the communities had markets, and the markets were set up in this area. They're set up on the basis of a 4 or an 8-day week. They did not have a 7-day week like we do, and which was, when I was doing my research, I was really surprised because I always made the assumption everyone had a 7-day week. But it turns out this community had basically, it was a 4-day week, and the 8-day week was just a doubling of the 4 days. Out of the week, a 4-day week, 1 day was set aside for the market. And in a community where you had a cluster of, lineages, or let's say a cluster of small villages that were related to a distant ancestor, they would rotate the market day among them, because you had to have a market, because you don't have refrigeration, so you had to buy food on a daily basis. So that's kind of the decisions that are made. What the most important decisions that are made by councils. The second thing is which relates to the coal mines, is young men who want to become senior men. That is, they want to become socially mature. They have to get married, and in order to get married, they have to have land, and they also have to have resources to pay the bride price. And a bride price is a series of let's say of goods or of services that a husband to be has to supply to the bride's family. That the rationale is that the groom's family is going to acquire access to her productive and reproductive functions, and productive meaning the work that she does as a farmer, and reproductive meaning the children that she has. So those kinds of decisions about how much a man has to give to her family, those are usually made by senior men in both families, and they're product of negotiation. So so for young men, and many of these young men who come to work in the coal mines, what they're trying to do is to put themselves in a position where they can afford to get married, and if possible, to actually become big men. And a big man is a man that has multiple wives. And in this area, you did have a few people who were quite wealthy, partly because of the slave trade, when it was going. But secondly, the palm oil trade, which is what replaces the slave trade. So that's pretty much the sort of background to this to this study. I don't know if I need to say anything else, Paul, or want me to. You asked questions before, so.
Well, I'm going to ask more.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you asked me one about missionaries, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to know what kind of impact Christianity had in this area, what the religion was like before, and why Christianity in the end had such wide appeal.
Oh, okay. Well, the religion before was, people believed in certain kinds of gods, and like many agricultural people, and this is true also in early Europe, one of the gods had to do with the fertility of the land. And in this area, each village had a shrine that they built to commemorate this god that was supposed to be the god of fertility for their land. So they did those kinds of sacrifices. They prayed to ancestors, because there was this belief, which really actually makes a lot of sense, that a family is not just the people living, but the ones who were the ancestors as well. And sometimes these people who are called Igbo, which I should have said earlier, sometimes they would believe in reincarnation. So they would believe that people could be born again. Someone would come back in the form of a young child. That's it reminded me a lot of one of the things that African Americans sometimes will say to certain children. They say, well, she's been here before, or he's been here before. And that's usually the people who act in some way that reminds a family of older people who they knew. So in this area, though, you do have this belief that people do come back. And you did have, these different gods that had certain functions, and people would sacrifice, for them. And they would honor them during the harvest, which was called the New Yam Festival, because the Igbos are one of their main foodstuffs is this yam that is, some of them are 10 pounds, and they may be as much as like almost a meter long. And those are considered sacred, but it's also a staple. And it's also gendered as male, so it's not a female product. The smaller yams are female, but they don't have this prestige of these other ones. Now, what makes Christianity popular is it's a series of things. First of all, there's contact. Christian contact goes back as early as the 1500s. And this was groups of Catholic priests who came to the Niger Delta area. And as part of their being in the area with the Kingdom of the Congo, which is in Angola. And that was, if you know that part of African history, people in the 1500s in that area, they became Christian. Excuse me, and they built cathedrals, and the King Alfonso was actually a Christian. Now in the 19th century, and 18th and 19th, that's when when Christianity really takes root. And people join the church because it gives them a sense of progress, and they get skills like being able to write and read. And they're very, very aware that this will make a difference in their lives and the lives of their children. The missionaries also were aware of that, so they set up a lot of schools, and they wanted very often, in fact, many of these schools were boarding schools, and they were purposely set up to pull children away from their families because they felt that the families were constantly holding them in the old religion, and they wanted them to become Christian. So many of them did. And then there wasn't a lot of opposition to Christianity in this area. But you did have different denominations. So this particular area around Enugu was mostly Catholic. And that's unusual because Eastern Nigeria is mostly Protestant. Excuse me. So, but this was, there was also this sense that Christianity was part of modernity. And people were very much aware of being progressive. And this was especially the case with the coal miners who saw themselves, excuse me, let me just get some water. They saw themselves as being a force of progress. And so they tended to be Christian as well. So the church had a very important role to play with these communities. But we also had you had a bishop who is Nigerian, Bishop Samuel Crowder, who was in charge of the what was called the Niger Diocese, and the Niger Diocese was around the Niger River. He was a person who was from the Yoruba area, just to the west of the Niger, and he was enslaved as part of this civil war that the Yoruba engaged in for several decades. He was put on a slave ship, and then his ship was intercepted as part of the abolition of the slave trade. It was intercepted, and he was taken to Sierra Leone, where he was educated, converted to Christianity, and then became a bishop. And so they brought him back, and he was the one in charge of these new churches that were set up in the Niger Delta. However, by the mid-19th century, the tropical medicine had advanced enough to be able to make it possible for Europeans to live in tropical areas without dying of yellow fever, malaria, etc. And when that happened, these young British missionaries refused to work under an African missionary. and they treated the government and also the church, the Anglican Church, treated Bishop Crowther very horribly and dismissed him and put some young person in charge of his job. This really upset a lot of people, and we had and this was not just the only place where you see this racial conflict. There, you found it in a lot of the other denominations too. But the result of it was that many Africans broke away and set up their own churches that were Christian, but they were they had like elements of African culture within them. So you do get in Nigeria, you get a whole proliferation of these kinds of churches, and they're very consciously set up to avoid the kind of racial conflicts that came about by being in some of the white churches. So, Paul, what else? I don't know.
Have you, well, so when did Christian missions really get into the Enugu area?
Oh, it's really in the 20th century. It's really in the beginning of the 20th century.
1920s, 1910s?
No, it was like around World War I. Yeah, just around that time.
So about the same time the coal mines opened.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, when the coal mines were open and the city of Enugu was laid out, that was the location of them, all of these missionaries came to the district officers and asked them for land for them to have a church. So they laid out the churches at this point, even before the city was set up. And the churches are still there. You know, they're still in the area.
And so who were the first to convert? The people that were slaves or the people who were the masters?
Well, in the Onitsha area, which is it's a big city right on the Niger Delta, they tended to be slaves. In fact, because freeborn people didn't want their children to be exposed to something that looked like an experiment. You know, these Christian churches, they thought they didn't know what to think of them. And so they put forward their most subordinate members of their community. The slaves, on the other hand, realized this could be a chance for them to get to negotiate, to be treated much better, and to move up socially. So they joined these churches very quickly, learned English, learned how to write, etc. But the effect that had with some people was that they thought of Christianity as a religion of slaves. So that kept them away. In other places too, one of the things that sort of gave a stigma to Christianity was that some of the chiefs, when they would give the missionaries an area where they could build a church, and what they would do is often give them the area which was called the Bad Bush area. The Bad Bush area is where you threw the bodies of people who were not entitled to have a funeral. And it was a place that was considered to be sort of almost haunted, and, you know, in a place where there's refuse, etc. So some of the churches were built on those kinds of sites. And it took a while before in some communities there was resistance to Christianity, and others they embraced it. So it really depended on the community.
Well, what kind of resistance? I mean, the Christian emphasis on having one wife must have been a factor.
Yeah, it definitely was. It was a factor even in the most westernized areas of Nigeria. That would be like Lagos, which had a whole strata of people who were descendants who had come from Sierra Leone, and they're often called westernized Africans because they were quite Victorian. I mean, some of the photographs of them show them as looking very much like with the kind of dresses and the suits, etc., very much like you would see people in England. What's fascinating about them is that those pictures and the pictures of African Americans in the same period are almost identical. Very, very interesting. They both realized that to present themselves as respectable, required that they have a certain kind of look. And that was something that was very important for people coming out of slavery in the US. And it was important for these people in Nigeria as well. So they, some of the literature and the history that's really interesting is the ways that men and women tried to balance the idea that polygyny was not supposed to be practiced if you were Christian, but yet if you were part of these African communities, this was a very important part of fitting in. And so for some of these returned slaves, they had relatives that were in the interior of the country, and the men, struggled with this because they were supposed to. One of the signs of wealth and prestige for a man is to have many wives, and that was because wives meant people who work for you. I mean, it wasn't the British completely, just like other Europeans, they completely misunderstood polygyny. They saw it as a sexual phenomenon, and it wasn't. It was mostly about labor, getting the labor of women, and being able to increase the size of your community, and because there was wealth in people rather than in with money, because money wasn't used that frequently. So those were some of the objections that the conflicts between educated Africans and the Christian churches. There were also issues about the use of their language, because some of the churches, some of the missionaries translated the Bible into these local languages, and some of them, like in the case in my area, in the Nugu area, there was a chief named Chief Onyama who was a slave trader, but when the British invaded, he became a helper. He helped them to get food for their troops, etc. And they made him a chief in an area that never had chiefs. But what he did is that he recognized that it was very important to learn English. And so what happened was that the Anglican Church, they were translating the Bible into Igbo. And so they tried to come into his village, and he refused to let them come in because he said, we don't need you to teach us our language. We need to learn English. So the Catholics taught in English, and that's why this area is Catholic, because he welcomed them in while he kept out the Anglicans. And it was all about language.
Okay. The article that we read for this week, which you wrote, could you talk more about that?
Yes, I can talk about it. The way that it's about a massacre.
What are you talking about?
The shooting of 22 minors.
Your article, because I'm not sure my voice is being recorded.
Oh, okay. It's called the Eva Valley Massacre. I can't remember the title. Sorry.
But it's assigned.
Yes. Well, okay, you all know the article, and you probably read it, hopefully, by now. It's actually an example of the kind of chaos that happened in the post-World War II period within not just the British Empire, but also in the empire for the French as well. And what I mean by that is World War II had the effect of forcing all the colonial governments and, well, let's say the metropolitan countries that control those governments, it had the effect of forcing them to try to reform the way they govern their colonies. In some cases, it meant that they allowed certain political changes, or in other cases, there were other kinds of social changes. One of the things that they did is they instituted trade unions. They brought trade unions to Africans rather than Africans demanding trade unions. And the reason for that is that the coal miners in Nigeria were very militant, and because there were no sort of regulations on the right to strike, they would strike without notice, and that was kind of what we would call a wildcat strike. So the British, during the war, introduced trade unions, got the coal miners to follow these, the quote rules that they set up for trade unions, and their trade unions were not as autonomous as trade unions are in England, but they looked like they were almost identical. But so what happens is they also pass laws that gave certain rights for Africans if they had disputes with the government. And so in this case, that meant that if they wanted to strike, they had the right to strike, but they had to give a warning period, which would usually give management a chance to make adjustments. And then they were supposed to, when they were trying to resolve the strike, they had the right to negotiate, but their negotiation had to be with mandatory arbitration. And arbitration means that you have to go along with whatever settlement is worked out. And so in this particular period, what had happened is there was a conflict about a previous strike, and the award for that strike did not take into consideration something that had happened that affected the coal miners themselves. So even though the strike was resolved, the coal miners felt that they had that, they were called hewers. They felt that they had been cheated in this, in that last agreement. The other thing that had happened, and this is really, it's sort of like gets very technical. The government was worried because the person who led the coal mining union was a militant nationalist. And what they decided to do is to figure out how to reduce his access to the miners themselves. And so what they did was they set up a branch structure in the mines, which meant that each occupational group had a representative on the committee that would constitute the union, they're like the governing committee for the union. And what this did is that, it makes sense if you have a tradition in your society in which you have branches. For Igbos, what they thought it was is 5 different unions, because they don't have, within their governing structure, they don't have this idea of representatives functioning in the way that this union did. So we ended up having a strike going on while the trade union person, the Secretary General, was in negotiations, and it led to the miners occupying the mines because they had an experience of being locked out, which was also against the law, the new law. And so they went into the mines. When the management came, they wanted them to help remove the explosives which are used in mining. And this came from the political, the political officials within the government. And this because they were nervous about this period, thinking that the radical nationalists might use those explosives to set up terrorists, to commit terrorist acts. And you have to remember that this is a period of the Cold War. This is post-World War II. So they see a communist under every rock. I mean, they couldn't figure out who was a communist and who wasn't in terms of the nationalist leaders. So they demanded that the miners help them to remove the explosives from this storage area. And the miners refused. And the police interpreted that as being that they were planning to use these explosives for something nefarious. What I realized, and I realized this after I had written my book, when I was looking at some other material, that the reason they refused to move the explosives is the removal of explosives was a job description that was very, very much inferior to their job. And so they considered it to be an insult for anyone to tell them that they had to carry explosives. So this is one of the reasons I got into studies of masculinity, because it really showed how you had, how important it was to these workers that their occupational levels be respected. And so then once the government decided that these men were dangerous, then they authorized their military to shoot them. And so it was the shooting. In the process of doing that, they almost made the country explode. And so that was what that article is about. It talks about the reforms and how the reforms led to this crisis. So I think you'll find it kind of interesting. It is a little technical because it gets into details about coal mining. But I think it's always important when you're looking at labor to figure out what are the power relationships in the workplace. Who affects whose job? Who determines how much money certain people get? So those are always important, and that's how you can understand conflicts between people who work. So that's me speaking as a labor historian.
As a labor historian, could you elaborate on some of the earlier problems of people not showing up for work, the 4-day week as opposed to a 7-day week, and those types of problems which I suppose relate to, the discipline that's involved in establishing a labor force?
Yeah, I did talk a little bit about the 4-day weeks, but what happens, in fact, this is another kind of answer where you get into the details of mining. Coal mining is one of the jobs that encourages, the workers are very often encouraged to have what is called an artisan's consciousness. And what you mean by that is that many coal miners bring in their own workers into the mines. They work as a group, and the miner is paid, and then he distributes the pay to others. And what happens with that kind of system is that they really develop this strong sense of what they're entitled to, the control they're supposed to have within the workplace. The reason that they can get away with this is because coal mining is dispersed. It's very hard for management to go to visit every spot that the miners are working in. And it's also for that reason they changed the work process to be where they work with a machine, and you do something called a long wall. They have like a long work face, and then they have a machine that just grinds the coal out. So, but in this case, the workers had a lot of control. They could sneak out of the mines, and they wouldn't know that they weren't, that the government, the management wouldn't know they weren't there. They could also slow down their work. And the manager, when the underground manager would show up, they would act fast. They would be trying to show that they were working quickly. What usually happens with mining is they usually have a lot of different types of pay. Some of it is piecework. Some of it is based on day wages. And in Nugu, those became very big issues. Certain people, in fact, the way you're supposed to make a mine function is make certain people have day wages while other people have pay wages. And the pay people push the day people to work more intense. But these workers were very, very autonomous. They also didn't show up to work if it interfered with their responsibilities in the village. So if it's a time when they're harvesting their crop, they may not show up to work because to them it's more important to have food in the family, or for them to participate in certain kinds of rituals. There's actually a really interesting article that E.P. Thompson wrote called Time and Industrial Time, Work, and I can't remember the whole title, but he talks about English workers who did exactly the same thing. This is in the earlier, like in the 18th century, when they would make decisions about whether to go to a village festival versus going to work. So those kinds of decisions, they had to do with the workers' social lives versus just their economic lives. So that's what the British just had a very hard time controlling these miners. They also didn't take care of the environment underground, so it was very hot down there. And what the workers did is that they would just not work a full week. Because they said it was so, they exerted themselves so much. So the average person would work maybe 3 days a week, because they said they just couldn't physically handle it. That also turns out to be something that's true of British miners as well. They have high absentee rates because the work is just very difficult. So.
Do you have more you can elaborate on in terms of slavery in the area?
Yeah, well, yes, I think that one of the things that I found out was how connected, well, let's say I had always thought of slavery as being something that was way in the past. And it surprised me when I got to Nigeria and I realized that you actually had slaves or people who were discriminated against because they were descendants of slaves. And so what I know that happened is that you had, I have already, well, I've just mentioned about these people in the area who employed slaves and they themselves were slave traders. I think that we found that it's very difficult to end slavery because the parts of slavery that are really difficult to get rid of are the ones about social acceptance. And you can't force people to accept other people. This came up in the Enugu area when some of the coal miners that were slaves, they they made a lot of money, and then they wanted to participate in certain rituals that freeborn wealthy men participated in. And that would be certain dances that only the freeborn could do, or other kinds of practices. They wanted to be able to marry freeborn women also. And then this conflict, the freeborn said they would never allow these slaves to marry into their families. Neither would they allow them to do certain dances. And so we ended up in this case of having separate ex-slave villages set up where these men could do the same kind of rituals. But when I did my interviews, the person I had with me who was showing me around, he said, "Oh, well, this person is a chief, but he's not really a chief because he's really a slave." So it just shows you the resilience of these sort of 19th century social categories.
So you just started to talk a bit about your methodology and your research technique because you referred to interviewing. Could you describe how you did your research?
Yes. Well, the first when I was working on my dissertation, I ran into a problem. This was in the 70s, early 70s. There was conflict between Nigeria and the U.S., and the Nigerians were not giving visas to people from during this period when I was trying to get over there. And so I was supposed to spend 3 months in England and 7 months in Nigeria. I spent 7 months in England and 3 months in Nigeria because it took that long for me to get visa clearance. So I did a lot of archival work in England, in London. I tried to use the time because I felt stuck. I didn't even know if I'd be able to get into Nigeria. And so I did all kinds of, studies. I went to a lot of the repositories of documents, colonial documents. I was able to find in the colonial, well, it's now called the National Archives, but it was the Public Records Office. I was able to go through all of the documents, the records of the correspondence between Nigerian officials and the colonial office. And so I was able to get that kind of work done. So when my visa first came through, I rushed to Nigeria almost immediately. And I had a Ford Foundation grant. And in those grants, in those days, they used to tell you, well, you have to take time to get acclimated to the area. It should take you a couple of weeks to do this and a couple of weeks to do that. And I had my 4-year-old son with me at that time. I landed in Nigeria on a Monday. On Tuesday, I was in the archives. I found a babysitter for him. I ran into a couple that, an African-American woman and a Nigerian man that had a son my son's age. So I set up my whole household situation within one day. And I went to the library, to the archives, 4 days a week until they closed. I think they closed about 2:00. And then I had someone from the coal corporation who would take me out to the villages to do interviews. And so the first time I went to the I went to the office where they were paying the pensioners, the men who had worked there before. So I was able to identify people who were mining in the very beginning in 1914. And so I went to the villages. I did interviews in some of these slave villages because I was really interested in the slavery issue. And I did an interview in this one village, and I asked the man, were there any slaves in your workforce, from your village? And he said, we were all slaves. And that's what I took he said, we were all slaves to the white man. And so that the title of my book was We Were All Slaves. I use that as a title. And then I just did the interviews I did were really, some of the ones on slavery were very difficult because I knew there was still discrimination against people. And with some of those, I just started the interview by saying I was a descendant of slaves in the United States. And see, a lot of times people don't know that history about slavery in the U.S. I even had someone that came to me, and someone that was looking at me and said, I heard that in the United States they have people who are my color. And this was like a very dark-skinned man. And I was shocked because I didn't realize that he didn't know. And I said, yeah, we do. Yes, we have, we're black. That's what they are. Me, they couldn't figure out what I was. I was kind of, it was kind of confusing to them. But that's for people who are not used to seeing different colors of black people, which is weird because in Eastern Nigeria, I was always mistaken for an Igbo. I saw people who were my complexion. I saw people who had freckles, and that's not unusual in that particular area. So that kind of shocked me. And it was as a woman, it wasn't that hard for me because people were kind of shocked to see me. When I did my first trip into the coal mines, I didn't realize they don't let women in the coal mines. But I just went in there. I even have a photo of myself with the miner's hat with the light on it and everything. When I went in there, they thought I was a man. And then they said, "Oh, madam, hello." So, and when I went in, they were just blasting too, which really scared me. But I felt like I had to. I think it's very important when you're doing this kind of research, you actually have to get as close as possible to what people are experiencing. So I felt like I needed to see what a coal mine was like. And it's a good thing I did because I didn't have a clue how you got coal off the wall. And in fact, when I wrote my dissertation, I thought that coal miners just take their little pickaxe and click, click, click and bring down coal. And it's only when I was doing my book that I realized what they do is they make a cut underneath, say a foot from the bottom, from the ground, so that the coal is hanging over. And then they blast it and it drops. They don't go picking with a little pickaxe. So that was really, that was funny. And that convinced me, like, Carolyn, you really need to know how they're doing this because you don't understand the jobs. You don't understand who gets along with who. And I realized that understanding the labor process was all very, very important. So,
can you talk a little bit about some of your other interesting research? I'm thinking, for example, about cowboys.
Oh yeah. Well, since I when I finished,
mention the word cowboys in case.
Yeah, so people can hear. Working on this coal mine so long, I decided that I was not going to switch to any other area of Nigeria, but I had to find another project because I knew this area, I knew people, I knew the history. And what I realized is I wanted to do a history of the town that focused on the groups of people who I felt gave the town its character. And so this is a town that became an administrative center of of the eastern provinces. So it had a lot of government facilities there. And the effect it had on the African population is it had hundreds of clerks. The clerks worked in the government installations, all over, they were all over the place. And I realized how interesting they were because they were the ones who were most receptive to nationalist ideas. They were the ones who they lived a little better than ordinary workers, but they had these aspirations that the colonial government just was not fulfilling. So they were the ones that really fueled some of these nationalist organizations. And they also had a wonderful set of papers. There was a group of newspapers run by a very radical nationalist named Nnamdi Azikiwe. And those newspapers, one of them, the West African Pilot, was directly targeting the clerks. And so I decided, I said, I want to do something on this area, on this town. And I'd like to focus on the clerks. And then I found out there was this group called the Cowboys, which were young men. They started during World War II, and they were young men who were not married for the major part. And what they used to do is to march around at Christmas and Easter wearing American cowboy outfits and singing songs in Yoruba. And they would sometimes stay outside someone's home and sing songs and beg for money, etc. So I decided to work on them, the clerks, and also professional letter writers, because I found I had a whole set of petitions written by men who were professional letter writers, because most of the workers were illiterate. So I was very fascinated by that too, because they wrote funny English. I mean, a very strange form of English, but and I realized how important that is. Like the way the way they framed the workers' grievance didn't really represent the workers that well, but it certainly represented what they thought. So now I'm looking at the phenomenon of masculinity, of how do men who have these jobs, African men who have these jobs, how do they experience colonialism, and also what are the things that motivate them to resist aspects of colonial rule? So I found out that with the clerks were the most interesting ones in many ways. I found out that those clerks, and this is where they are up in your area, Paul, many of the clerks from the coast were stationed up in northern Nigeria. And that's because, the British did not allow schools to be formed in northern Nigeria because of the Muslim faith. And so they had to use Yoruba and Igbos to be in the civil service, and also the commercial enterprises did the same thing. And what happened is there were these cases around 1910, 1912, where these clerks were publicly whipped. They were getting whipped for very silly things. Like some of them were whipped because when they passed the resident's house, they didn't stop and sort of bow. There was also a case of two women who had run across the lawn of the resident, and he had them captured, stripped naked, and beaten in the public square. This is a Muslim area. Beaten in the public square once a week for 6 weeks. Then the one of the clerks was also stripped and beaten because he was playing soccer and he knocked over something in the market. So those kinds of incidents, I realized that this is about humiliation. This is really about the resentment of these officials who really didn't like the fact that these Africans were so precocious and uppity. And I actually found a picture. I'm going to send it to you, Paul. I got someone looked in the United Africa Company records in England, and they had a photograph of a group of Nigerian clerks standing on very tall steps, and all of them were dressed like someone from Gentleman's Quarterly, the magazine. I mean, they were all each one had a certain style on. They had these hats and stuff. And I looked at them and I said, this is like a competition between these two types of men. So I have a whole discussion about colonial masculinity, which is these British men who come to the colonies very often to run away from things in England. They feel that in the early 20th century, women are not really holding their place. I mean, they're stepping out into the world and they shouldn't be doing that. So they go to the colonies because they can push them around. Yeah. Okay. Is it time to stop? Yeah.
Sorry, Carolyn. I was passing him a note to see if you could adjust your cam just to so that we keep losing the bottom of your face there. Just.
Okay.
Or sit back.
Oh.
Does that help?
Yeah.
I can't.
That helps a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm
sorry to drop the.
Oh, sorry. We're at 58 minutes. So
Okay.
So I have one more question.
Oh no. Okay.
Well, you've also done a lot of work on World War II.
Oh yeah. That's one of my favorite topics. And I think that's because I was born right almost at the end.
What's your favorite topic?
World War II.
Okay, thank you.
It really is. And I did work with 3 other scholars, Judith Byfield, Tim Parsons, and Amit Sikanga. We put together a book called Africa in World War II, which came out in 2015, Cambridge Press. And all of us realized that Africa is left out of the narrative of World War II. And when we started, we had several conferences and just asked people, if your work is over, if you cover this period of the war, can you pull anything together that brings a perspective of what was happening in your area during the war? And we were shocked at the things that we found. I mean, it was just amazing. I, for example, did not know that the uranium that was used for the atomic bomb came from the Congo. I also didn't know that de Gaulle's capital with Free France, before they liberated France, was in Brazzaville. I didn't know either that before the U.S. got into World War II, the British were fighting in Egypt, and they were fighting against Rommel, who, by the way, was like filming. When you see pictures of Rommel on Google, they look like somebody did his makeup, did his hair. He was a star for the Nazis. And what was happening is that the British were losing so many airplanes in their fighting with the Germans. And the Germans had gotten dragged in because Mussolini had decided to fight in that area. And so what happened is Roosevelt had met with Churchill, and he worked out a deal where he would fly, and see, this is the U.S. is supposed to be neutral. He would get an airline to fly airplanes from the United States to Brazil, and from Brazil over to Gambia, and then from there it would hop along the coast and then go straight up the Nile River and be there in Cairo. And what he couldn't do is American troops could not fly there because that was an area of belligerence. So you know what he did? He worked out a deal with Pan American Airlines, believe it or not, and Pan Am's pilots flew those airplanes from the United States all the way to Cairo, and they stopped along the way, and they set up airfields in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria, they went across Chad. That was how they got to the north. And the reason they could get through Chad is because the Governor General Felix Eboué, who was from French Suriname, he did not follow the Vichy's. He defected and became a supporter of Free France. So the whole equatorial Africa was Free France. And because of that, they could fly right across Chad. They had a base in Chad, then go up the Nile River and land these airplanes. And that was very important because it isn't until Pearl Harbor happens that the U.S. gets into the war. And so when Pearl Harbor did happen, it turned out the U.S. had all these bases already built, which Pan Am had built for them. And they just militarized those bases. And the way they used to get to Asia, because of the Pearl Harbor, destruction of Pearl Harbor, they would fly across Africa. So they went all the way across Africa and then into Asia instead of going across the US, and because they didn't have the places to land. So that part, that was called the Takoradi route, or the Trans-Saharan ferry route. But it's a very interesting story that nobody ever tells. There's a dissertation at CUNY that is about this. And when we had our conference, we invited a guy who was doing a film on this because his father was one of the pilots. And so he was really, I don't think he ever finished the film, but they did some of the pilots wrote books about their experience. But so that's just one of the things. Then we also found out that Durban was where they used to repair ships, in the Indian Ocean. And the food that fed the troops in North Africa was coming from Zimbabwe, from Rhodesia. I mean, there were just a lot of facts. The number one place that they got industrial diamonds was Sierra Leone and South Africa. So you could write a whole history of the war that just focused on Africa. And that's kind of what we did, but ours is like an anthology, so it's not a textbook. But I understand after we did that book, now there's a group that's going to do one on the Caribbean during the war, because that was also very important. So, and then of course you had the troops that went to Burma. That was where the West African troops were sent there to fight against the Japanese, because the British said, oh, they're Africans, so they can handle the jungle, which was really not true. Most of Africa is not a jungle. So most of these men had been from savanna areas, but they brought them, they sent them off to Burma, and thousands of them. So that was the large part of the experience. Many of them were in Ethiopia also. They liberated Ethiopia. So it's a very important, I teach a course on that, on World War II in Africa, and I've taught it maybe 4 or 5 years. So that's, and I like that. There's so much stuff on World War II that there's lots of videos. There's all these guys that I call them the history workshop guys. Those are the ones who love to tell you what tank is used when, and and they I used to not know the difference between a Panzer and a Sherman tank, but my students, they really made me know the differences, and they would tell me, well, Professor Brown, that particular tank cannot go across the desert sands because the desert sands mess up the gears, and they do so and so, which is very important for me to know. Yeah, so I just love teaching World War II. Plus, I almost remember it. I remember right after the war. But not, so I was born in '44, so it was still going. But that's one of my secret loves is World War II in Africa.
Okay, do you have any sum up of for the students of why you think all this is important?
Yeah, I think it's important I think world history is important, and it's important to really understand some of the major factors that sort of create the world that we live in today. And especially in terms of Africa, because Africa is often described as some kind of primitive, something that really doesn't matter. And of course, my president just added to that by his cursing about Africa, which just made me, emphasize how little he knows. But it's just important to get a full understanding of what happened on the continent. And it also gives you insight about your own country. Because I mean, many things that I hadn't thought about the U.S., the fact that I studied Africa made me raise some of those questions. And I just didn't know. For example, like the book I'm doing on Enugu, one of the things that I've come across is how social engineering of reflected race. How the design of cities was such that it would show that certain social groups were supposed to be controlled in particular ways. And I realized that, and then I look at our cities and I say, oh, now I understand. It's very much the same. So I did, and I I think it's you do learn more about your own place when you step outside of it and look at Africa. The other thing that's encouraged me to work on Africa is the real increase in the number of African immigrants that have come to the United States. And one of the things that that really got me upset when Trump said this was that I knew that the African immigrants were the highest educated group, even more than the Asians in the United States of immigrants. I knew that because that's the brain drain. It's a thing that we've been lamenting, those of us that work on Africa. So I dug into the census, and sure enough, there are all these charts that show that Egyptians and then Nigerians have the highest, something like 40% of them have BAs. With the women, 30% have master's degrees. And in my state, in New Jersey, we're the state, like 5% of our foreign population. We have 15% of our population is foreign born. 5% are Africans. And so I have a lot of students who are African students. So it's also important. It's important to know this. And it's also, if you're teaching, it's important to teach them this, because they don't know. If they grew up in the United States, they know as little as American kids do about their own countries, the countries they came from. So I enjoy teaching them, and I think it's very important for us to understand the people who make up our communities.